Now you can see the difference between dissociative amnesia, where you forget small details generally surrounding the event or periods of time around the event, or even the generalized amnesia where you forget all sorts of stuff about your personal identity, to dissociative fugue. Here's an example. Jay, a high school physics teacher in New York City, disappeared 3 days after his wife unexpectedly left him for another man. 6 months later, he was discovered tending a bar in Miami Beach. Calling himself Martin, he claimed to have no recollection of his past life and insisted that he had never been married. So you see the difference there? Dissociative fugue, they almost always take off, and they abandon their past identity for a new one. It's not just that they're forgetting, they're totally abandoning ship. Criteria for the DSM. Person suddenly moves away from home and assumes a new identity with little or no memory of the previous identity or past. A person travels away from home abruptly and unexpectedly and is unable to recall some or all of their past, is confused about their identity, or even some disintegration of identity. They assume a partially or completely new identity, and they may seem normal to people who don't know them previously. This is very rare, about 0.2% of people in the country ever have this. Okay, so you see what the main criteria is, not just forgetting, but also leaving. Whereas dissociative amnesia, they're forgetting, but they're still staying put. What's happening? Stressor or traumatic event is the most common. They could be physically or mentally escaping, or both, a threatening environment or intolerable situation. So again, we have that avoidance that's happening also with the dissociative amnesia. Chronic stress, depression is generally more involved with this than with the dissociative amnesia. So dissociative fugue, there tends to be a longer period of stress. Dissociative amnesia is bang, something happens, big traumatic event, there's some trigger. Dissociative fugue, there still tends to be a trigger, but there's also more chronic elements. It's more long-term leading up to this. So those are two different things you might look for depending on if it's dissociative amnesia or fugue. But you can't mistake fugue. I mean, the person has left town. Oftentimes, there's been a big manhunt for the person, looking, wanted posters, help me find this person, and so on. And then 6 months later, a year later, 10 years later, somebody recognizes them in a town 300 miles away working at, the gas station or something. Treatment. It usually ends on its own. Somebody finds the person sees themselves on TV, like a missing persons show, and all of a sudden it triggers all their memories to come back. Possibly because during that fugue state period, their mind has dealt with and adjusted and made new neuronal connections in order to handle the stress a little bit better, and the brain is just ready to deal with it, ready to come back to the present, the real world. Following the episode of the fugue state, they may not recall the events that took place during the fugue state, which is another interesting thing. So this is somebody who has a really good ability to dissociate and to forget, and their brain is working in a way where it's very easy to suppress these memories, or to not make the memories, perhaps. So best way to help them: supportive psychotherapy, supportive relationships, building the support network, helping them to deal with stressors. Remember, this dissociation is all about the inability to deal with stress and trying to avoid or escape the situation. And so if you can help them to cope with stress better, then they don't need to dissociate anymore. One of the problems, though, is that dissociation becomes a coping method, and so it can become a habit, and the person uses dissociation in order to deal with even small stressors sometimes if it becomes a big enough habit. So that can be difficult to help them to deal with. Depersonalization disorder, this is the next one. So this is when you just feel like an out-of-body experience. You're not in your body anymore. So you may feel detached or estranged from your thoughts or your body. So it's not necessarily just physical. It can also be your own thoughts, so like somebody else is thinking for you. Feeling like an outside observer, a robot, feeling like you're in a dream, watching a movie, like there's somebody else controlling your body or your thoughts, and you're sort of in the back seat, and you're not in yourself anymore, mind and body. Reality testing remains intact during periods of depersonalization. So basically, you understand what's real and what's not. It's not like you're hallucinating or you're having a paranoid delusions or delusions of any sort. You're sane. Your mind is working and functioning. It's just like it's not attached to what's actually going on in your body. Derealization can happen. You lose sense of the external world. The people may seem mechanical or dead. It feels like you're in a dream. Your body or the things around you can change size or shape. So sometimes, especially with derealization, it can be difficult to determine whether they're hallucinating or they're having derealization. But again, remember that reality testing is still intact. So you can ask them, "Was this real?" And they'll say, "No, it felt like a dream. It didn't feel real to them." So they know the difference between reality and not, even though there may be some merging of hallucinations and derealization. The difference is somebody hallucinating usually believes that it's real, whereas the person who's derealization, they totally understand that this is not real, that there's something strange going on. Occasional experiences of depersonalization are very common with people. Half of all adults have had an episode of depersonalization, generally one short period or maybe a few over their lifespan, but very short period. And is often associated with a lot of stress, which is not surprising. So if you're going to diagnose somebody with depersonalization disorder, doesn't mean that they've just experienced depersonalization, but it's severe, it's persistent, it's frequent, and of course it causes distress in their life. Now, we don't know a lot about depersonalization disorder. This is not something that psychologists have ever been super interested in, which is unfortunate, but there's a lot of mental disorders and not all that many psychologists. 50% of people with depersonalization also have an anxiety or mood disorder. So if you do a DSM diagnosis on this one, then absolutely look for another anxiety or mood disorder to go along with that person. You probably are not going to have a personality disorder, a psychotic disorder, or something along those lines. Remember, they usually only have anxiety or mood disorders. Cognitive deficit, so they usually have a hard time focusing, hard time remembering, hard time doing spatial reasoning, which is like three-dimensional mathematical reasoning. And then they have deficits in emotional responding. They tend to inhibit their emotional expression, probably because they have a hard time dealing with emotions, so they don't want to let their own out, or, they'll start getting upset, they'll start getting stressed out, and that's what they want to avoid. These disorders are all about avoidance. There's also dysregulation in the HPA axis, which is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So this is your thyroid, your adrenal glands, your fight or flight response is very much associated with the HPA axis. So these people may be having an intense stress experience, more intense than the rest of us, and so that's why they want to inhibit their emotions. They want to escape from them, escape from their self, because they feel these things so intensely. All right, dissociative identity disorder. This is I was going to say this is the fun one. It's probably not fun for the people experiencing it, but it's an interesting one to discuss. Norma has frequent memory gaps and cannot account for her whereabouts during certain periods of time. While being interviewed by a clinical psychologist, she began speaking in a childlike voice. She claimed that her name was Donna and that she was only 6 years old. Moments later, she seemed to revert to her adult voice and had no recollection of speaking in a childlike voice or claiming that her name was Donna. Classic dissociative identity disorder. If it happened like that in a therapy session, it would be a really easy diagnosis. It does not always happen that obviously. It can take years to get a diagnosis. Sometimes the personalities are not that dramatically different, and that can be when it's hard to diagnose a person with this disorder. So it was originally known as multiple personality disorder. People thought that was too politically incorrect, and so we changed it. You have 2 or more distinct personalities. I've heard of people having like 20-some, 30-some personalities. It is very rare, and it is very controversial. There are a lot of people who don't believe that this disorder actually exists. It's been tried as a criminal defense. I mentioned that before. And you can watch this yourself. I'm going to link to it also on the page, or you can click on it, the links on the PowerPoint. But this is the story of Herschel Walker, the football player, and his dissociative identity disorder. And you'll hear in there that basically nobody believes that he actually has it. So yeah, anyhow, you'll get the idea. Okay, so criteria: 2 or more distinct identities or personalities. Distinct is a subjective term. Sometimes it's easier to tell than others if the person has different identities. You can also do functional MRI scans where you scan the brain and what's active, and these experiments have been done. The personalities have different brain signatures. Some personalities can be diabetic, while the regular person isn't diabetic and they need insulin, or they'll go into hyperinsulinemia, I think it's called, or hyperglycemic shock, things like that. There can be personalities that are deaf, personalities that are blind, personalities with physical disorders like a limp, and they actually show real inflammation in the knee. I mean, it's controversial, but there's a lot of evidence to show that, yes, this is a real disorder. And one of the things that these personalities do is they recurrently, so over and over again, they take control of the person's behavior. Some personalities are in charge. They take over from, there's like the main person, but then there's the other personalities that will take the lead. And some personalities are more dominant than others. Some are more aggressive. They tend to have certain responsibilities. One might be in charge of dealing with schoolwork, another in charge of dealing with your family, another in charge of dealing with your spouse, another in charge of when you're sad or when you're angry. And so these are all parts of your personality that they become specialized in order to deal with things. And it's all to protect the main personality, the main person. And one of the things that happens is that there's blackouts. Again, this is the dissociation. So some personalities are aware of everything. Some personalities are very isolated. Sometimes the main person will be aware of what's going on, and sometimes they have a total blackout. Sometimes the personalities will agree to do like videos or keep a journal so that everybody can keep track of what's going on and communicate with each other. And of course, like everything else, the disturbance is not due to the effects of substance or general medical condition. If it is, that supersedes the diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder. If it's a physical cause or caused by drugs or something like that, you do not actually have the disorder. You have, you're using drugs. Oh, let's see, I talked about a lot of this. Each personality has its own pattern of perceiving, relating, thinking, unique behaviors, unique handwriting, memories, relationships, and so on. They are often unaware of each other. Transitions between the alters, or the different personalities, are usually abrupt and often triggered by stress or external cues. So what is required in this situation to be dealt with will trigger a certain personality or alter to appear. Self-mutilation, post-traumatic stress, conversion symptoms. Those are like the psychosomatic symptoms going on. Suicidal behaviors. These are all common. Somebody with dissociative identity disorder has been through extreme trauma in their life, and these are all symptoms that are associated with post-traumatic stress disorder. And then a very high incident of comorbid psychological disorder. So again, doing your DSM diagnosis for this, you need to look at substance abuse, depression, anxiety, eating disorders, and borderline personality disorder. If you put any of those along with this diagnosis, then I can most likely accept that. It is rare, 0.5 to 1% in non-clinical samples. 3 to 6% of inpatients have this diagnosis. So these are people who have been hospitalized because of psychological disorders. Unsurprisingly, it is much more common. The onset is almost always in childhood. It's much more frequent in women, 3 to 9 times as much. And then women also tend to have more identities than men. According to one study, women had 15 on average, men had 8 on average. Why that is, it's really hard to say. It tends to last a lifetime in the absence of treatment. And even with treatment, it's usually more of learning how to deal with it and coping rather than integrating it, although that is the goal, is to integrate all of those personalities. And then the frequency of switching, how many personalities there are, that can change across the lifespan. I already talked about biological correlate. So there are biological differences in how each alter ego works. All right, so what causes it? The etiology. Alters are created with extreme, super bad, really severe childhood trauma. Almost always there is physical and sexual abuse. It can be either or, but it is severe. I mean, like beating the crap out of a child, a lot of molestation, usually violent molestation, started at a very young age. Anybody with dissociative identity disorder has been through crap in their life. So dissociation is the escape. It's about avoidance. There's unbearable emotional or physical pain. They cannot deal with this. It is so severe that they can't deal with it, and there's no other escape. There's no way to get away from it. And so their identity sort of fractures, and one personality says, I'll deal with this. You just go to your safe place and don't worry about what's going on. I'm going to deal with this issue. And other personalities might also jump in and say, I'll deal with this other stuff. And then it sort of becomes the primary coping mechanism of their life. Certain personalities are in charge of different situations. The type of person who gets dissociative identity disorder, this is what we call the diathesis stress model. So diathesis stress says that there are genetic tendencies towards this behavior or this issue, and then a stressor triggers it. So this is a person who already has the ability to really dissociate well. They're suggestible, they're imaginative, they're more easily hypnotized. They have a stronger internal fantasy life. They're more likely to daydream. If you don't daydream, you're probably not going to get dissociative identity disorder. So this is a person who very easily already dissociates. And then when they have this extreme stress and trauma in their life, then they use that ability to quickly escape the situation. Also, they lack social support. You don't need to escape if your mother is there to hug you and say, it's okay, I'm going to protect you. That's your coping mechanism. You don't need to dissociate in order to cope if you have people around you who support you and are there for you. They also tend to have a chaotic, non-supportive family environment. So this is, you come out and say, Uncle Tom molested me for the past 10 years of my life, and your mother screams at you and says, how dare you make accusations like that? That would never happen in this family, and kicks you out of the house. You're much more likely to get dissociative identity disorder. And then, well, it probably wouldn't be the past 10 years because the window of vulnerability is usually 9 years old. So it tends to happen before 9 years old. All right, treatment. Difficult to treat. The goal is to integrate the alters into one personality. Now, let me just say right here that all disorders are about distress and dysfunction in life. Some people with this disorder find that certain personalities are really helpful, and they like personalities. I watched a video a while back about an artist with this disorder, and although it causes difficulties, she also likes and appreciates that she has the different personalities because they all have their own unique artistic styles and so on. So there can be benefits to there are benefits to it. They wouldn't have this disorder if there weren't benefits to it. It can be beneficial to not have to stand up for yourself and know that somebody else is going to jump in every single time when there's the need to defend yourself and you don't have to do it. Sort of like having a big sister that's built into your own brain. So it can be difficult to integrate. Some people don't want to integrate, and there may be certain personalities that you don't want to integrate, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. So you want to identify each personality. What is its functions, roles, and concerns? So for instance, if you had a big sister personality that fought the battles for you, can you then teach the main personality to stand up for themselves? And then they may not need that personality. Now the weird thing is that sometimes these personalities don't want to be integrated. I'm my own person. I don't want my life to end. I'm living my life, and you want, as the therapist, you want me to disappear? And the personalities will fight back against the idea of integration. So sometimes it's necessary to negotiate, to compromise, and sometimes you may just accept certain personalities will stay around forever. Trauma work, again, dealing with the emotions and the experiences and reliving things and handling the emotions without depersonalizing and dissociating, helping them to develop strategies for dealing with stress. Use of hypnosis, again, it happens. Some people say it's helpful. I do not support the use of hypnosis for psychotherapy. A lot of people agree with me. Probably more people agree with me than use hypnosis. But I don't know. Is there a time and place for it? Maybe, but not in my opinion. All right, long-term psychotherapy, probably years of psychotherapy to help these people. Antidepressants, anti-anxiety drugs could be helpful, but yeah, I mean, this is such a controversial area. You really have to specialize in dissociative identity disorder. Some people have accused the therapists of creating dissociative identity disorder, especially if hypnosis has been used. Yeah, so it's a really interesting area, really interesting, but it's probably one of the more difficult areas to specialize in. All right, 1930 to 1960, there was 2 cases per decade diagnosed in the U.S. In the 1980s, we had 20,000 cases reported. So there was a huge spike between the 60s and the 80s. I mean, in 20 years, we went from 2 per decade to 20,000 in 1 year, which is insane. Many more cases in the U.S. than elsewhere. So the question is this a real thing? And we were just underreporting it before, so we didn't realize all these people had it when, we only caught 2, and because we just weren't looking? Or is this something that we therapists and psychologists are sort of making up? That's sort of what the controversy is. Is it real? Or is it something that people are being convinced they have? Or maybe because now this is common in our society, like, after the movie Sybil came out, now everybody thinks they have it. So there's really no answer at the moment. But like I said, there is some research saying that this is real. And if somebody thinks they have it, does it matter? I don't know. It's curious. It's a really interesting, really interesting diagnosis. All right, so some psychologists claim there's no such thing as this dissociative identity disorder. They point to the dramatic increase in cases in the last decades. They're saying they're consciously or unconsciously faking the symptoms because of therapist suggestions or movies. Defenders say that many patients experience symptoms before entering treatment or learning about the disorder, although I don't know anybody who doesn't know about this. And they say the increase in cases are because of greater clinical awareness, improved diagnosis and diagnostic description, increased screening, and so on. So, but we see this same effect, the same phenomena happening with other things like autism. Autism suddenly had this skyrocket in diagnoses. Is that because autism increased? Is it because we're getting better at catching it? We understand it better? Is it because therapists are just labeling any weird, shy kid with autism, which I think there's a lot of truth to that last one. Some kids just don't fit in normally. They're more artistic, more sensitive, shy, and so that can look like autism. So again, lots of controversy about it. There's probably truth to all of those claims. So it's hard to say. All right, let's see, we already talked about all that. So yeah, so that's it. So we talked about, where's my slide with everything on it? We talked about dissociative amnesia, forgetting your important personal information, specific information, and you stay put, versus dissociative fugue, you forget who you are in entirety and you move away. Depersonalization is where you're feeling detached from your own mental state or body. And then dissociative identity disorder, where you have distinct personalities. Remember, all of these are about avoiding stress. There has been some stress trigger, some trauma in your life where you can't deal with it. You have no coping skills that can handle this situation. You don't have a support network, and so you have to get away from it. And in these particular situations, the people are already good at dissociating. They're already daydreamers. They're good at dissociation. And there's no good alternative. There's no other way to escape the situation than dissociating. All right, so like I said, there's other disorders that can be similar to it, but these are the only ones that are actually dissociative disorders. All right, so interesting topic, and we'll call it for a day.